My father just married a woman my age, and now they're demanding I let them move into my childhood home and take over my parents' estate while leaving me with nothing. It's time you understand that this is what's best for everyone. We're moving in, Sarah. It's not up for discussion. Those words from my father, Alan, 58M, sent a wave of disbelief through me. I stared at him and his new wife, Hannah, 29F, a woman who was barely a year older than me, as they stood in the doorway of the house I had grown up in, my childhood home, the home that my mother had lovingly maintained for decades before she passed away 2 years ago. And now, my father and this woman, who could have easily been one of my classmates in college, were telling me that they were taking over. Not just the house, but everything, my parents' estate, all the financial assets, everything my mother had worked so hard to build. And what was I left with? Nothing. It all started a few months ago when my father dropped the bombshell that he was getting remarried. I remember the phone call clearly, his voice filled with excitement that felt out of place given how quickly everything had moved. "I've met someone, Sarah," he said, his tone almost giddy. "Her name is Hannah, and we're getting married next month. I want you to meet her." I was stunned. My mother had only been gone for 2 years, and now he was rushing into another marriage. My mind raced with questions, but the one that stood out most was why. Why was he doing this? Why now? But when I met Hannah, I understood. She was beautiful, bubbly, and young, so young. She seemed more like someone I'd grab coffee with than someone who would become my stepmother. I was polite, of course, because that's what you do when you're faced with a situation that feels too surreal to process. But as the weeks went by, I started to notice things that set me on edge. The way she subtly inserted herself into conversations about family matters, or how she'd laugh off any mention of my mother as though she was irrelevant to the life my father was building with her. I tried to keep my distance, telling myself that it was my father's life and his choice. He was an adult, capable of making his own decisions, even if those decisions baffled me. But then the wedding happened. A small, quiet ceremony, nothing like the beautiful celebration my parents had when they married decades ago. I didn't even attend. I couldn't. It was too much too soon. And now, a month after the wedding, they had shown up at the house, my house, telling me that they were moving in. They didn't ask. They told me as though it was a foregone conclusion. "Dad, this is insane." I finally managed, my voice trembling with anger. "This is my home. I grew up here. You can't just decide to move in without talking to me about it first." Hannah smiled, that irritatingly sweet, condescending smile that had become all too familiar. "Sarah, I know this is a lot for you to process, but it's what your father and I have decided. We want to make this house a home again, and we think it's the best thing for the family." For the family? What family was she talking about? My mother was gone, and now it felt like they were trying to erase her completely, like she had never existed in the first place. This was the house where my mother had raised me, where we had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and every milestone in between. And now my father was trying to hand it over to this woman he barely knew, who had no connection to any of the memories that lived inside these walls. "I can't believe this," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You're just going to take over everything. The house, the estate, Mom's everything, and leave me with nothing." My father, who had been standing silently beside Hannah, finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, but there was a firmness in it that made my stomach churn. "Sarah, it's not about leaving you with nothing. Hannah and I just think it's time for some changes. You're an adult now, and you don't need the house. You have your own life, your own place. We're thinking about the future." I stared at him, hardly able to believe what I was hearing. "The future? You're talking about taking everything Mom left behind, and you're calling it thinking about the future. What about me? What about what I need?" Hannah stepped forward, her voice gentle but patronizing. "Sarah, your father and I will make sure you're taken care of. But this house, it's too big for just you. We want to fill it with new memories with our own family." The words hit me like a slap. Our own family. She was talking about starting a family with my father in the house I had grown up in. A house filled with memories of my family, my mother and me. And now they were telling me that none of that mattered. They were going to take it all and build their own life on top of it. I looked at my father, hoping for some sign that he understood what he was doing to me. but his face was unreadable. It was like he had already made up his mind, and no amount of reasoning would change it. "You can't just take everything," I said, my voice shaking. "This isn't right. Mom's estate, the house, it's not just yours to give away." My father's eyes softened, but his words were no less crushing. "Sarah, your mother wanted me to be happy. I loved her, but she's gone. And now I need to move on. Hannah is my future. You'll always have a place here, but you need to accept that things are changing." My heart pounded in my chest as I looked at the two of them, standing together as if they had already replaced everything my mother had meant to me, as if their new life together was more important than the years we had spent as a family. The betrayal was sharp, cutting deeper than I ever thought possible. They wanted everything: my childhood home, the estate my mother had carefully managed, the life we had built. And they were leaving me with nothing. It wasn't just the loss of the house or the money. It was the loss of my father, too. The man who had raised me, who had loved my mother, was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as an inconvenience, an obstacle to the new life he was building with a woman who could have been my peer. I stood there, speechless, as they waited for me to accept their decision. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I wasn't going to let them take everything from me, not without a fight. The days after my father's announcement felt like a blur. I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head, his cold detachment, Hannah's smug assurance that they were taking over the house, and my life along with it. My father had always been pragmatic, but this was beyond anything I had expected from him. It felt like a betrayal, not just of me, but of my mother's memory. I thought maybe he'd reconsider after seeing how upset I was, that he'd realize how much the house meant to me. But instead, he pushed forward as if nothing had changed. A week later, I woke up to the sound of boxes being dragged into the house. Hannah and my father were moving in. I stood at the top of the stairs, watching as they brought in their things, trying to swallow the rising wave of anger and disbelief. It was surreal, watching a woman my age unpack her life into the house I grew up in, rearranging the furniture, taking down the family photos that my mother had lovingly framed and hung over the years. Hannah seemed to be taking great pleasure in it too. She kept making little comments as if she were doing me a favor by moving in. "This place was so outdated, Sarah. I can't wait to modernize it a little. Bring some life back into these old walls." I clenched my fists at my sides. Outdated? This was the house my mother had decorated, each piece of furniture chosen with care. It was a home filled with memories, with years of family traditions, and she was talking about it like it was some fixer-upper she was going to improve. "It doesn't need to be modernized," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It was perfect the way it was. Hannah flashed me that irritatingly sweet smile, the one that made it clear she wasn't listening. "I know it's hard for you, Sarah. But you'll see, once we've settled in, it'll feel more like a real home." I wanted to scream, to tell her that this was a real home, that it had been my home long before she showed up. But I didn't trust myself to say anything without exploding, so I turned and went upstairs, leaving her to her invasion. As the days went on, it became clear that Hannah was here to stay. She took over everything, from redecorating the living room to rearranging the kitchen. She even started talking about converting my old bedroom into a nursery, hinting that she and my father were planning to start a family soon. Every time she brought it up, I felt a fresh wave of nausea. One afternoon, I found her in my mother's old study, rifling through papers and documents. "What are you doing in here?" I demanded, my voice sharp. Hannah looked up, startled for a moment, but then composed herself. "Oh, I was just going through some of your mother's old things. We need to sort out the estate, make sure everything is in order for the future." I stepped into the room, feeling my heart race. "The estate is my mother's. It's not yours to touch." She gave me that infuriating smile again, her voice dripping with condescension. "Sarah, I know this is difficult for you, but your father and I are married now. What's his is mine, and we need to take care of these things together. It's what your father wants." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was talking about the estate as if she had a right to it, as if the years my mother had spent managing our family's finances meant nothing. "You have no right to any of this," I said, my voice trembling. "This was my mother's. This house, the estate, it's all part of her legacy." Hannah's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Sarah, I understand that you're attached to this place, but it's time to move on." Her father and I have plans for the future, and that future includes this estate. We're not here to push you out, but you need to accept that things are changing. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. We're not here to push you out. That was exactly what they were doing, taking over everything, leaving me with nothing. My father had always been pragmatic, but I never thought he'd go this far. I never thought he'd let someone like Hannah waltz in and tear apart the life we had built, piece by piece. Does my father know what you're doing? I asked, my voice tight with anger. Hannah stood up, folding the papers she had been looking through. Of course he does. We're a team now, Sarah. Your father and I make decisions together. It's time you start accepting that. I could barely breathe. I turned and left the study, my mind racing with anger and disbelief. How could my father let this happen? How could he let this woman take over everything, erasing my mother's memory, erasing me? That night, I confronted him. He was sitting in the living room flipping through the channels on the TV like it was any other evening. But it wasn't any other evening. Not for me. I stood in front of him, blocking his view of the television, my heart pounding in my chest. Dad, we need to talk. He sighed, turning off the TV. Sarah, I don't want to argue again. I'm not here to argue, I said, my voice trembling. I'm here to understand. How could you let this happen? How could you let Hannah take over everything? This was Mom's house, Mom's estate, and now you're just giving it all away. He rubbed his temples, clearly tired of the conversation. Sarah, I've explained this already. Hannah and I are married now. She's part of the family, and we need to think about the future. I stared at him, hardly able to recognize the man sitting in front of me. The future? What about me? What about the future I was supposed to have? You're talking about giving everything to her and leaving me with nothing. You're not being left with nothing, he said, his voice exasperated. You have your own life, your own job, your own place. You don't need the house or the estate. It's time to move on, Sarah. You're holding onto the past, and that's not healthy. The words hit me like a physical blow. He was telling me to let go of the only thing I had left of my mother, the house that had been the center of our family for as long as I could remember. And for what? So he could start a new life with a woman who barely knew us. You're choosing her over me, I said quietly, the weight of the realization settling over me like a heavy fog. You're choosing her over everything Mom built, over everything we had as a family. He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. It's not about choosing sides, Sarah. It's about moving forward. I felt my throat tighten with emotion, but I refused to let the tears fall. I'm not going to let you erase everything that matters to me. I won't let you erase Mom. He stood up, his face hardening. I'm not erasing anything. But this is my decision, and I expect you to respect it. I stared at him, 1,000 words stuck in my throat, but none of them came out. The man standing in front of me wasn't the father I had known my entire life. He was someone else, someone I didn't recognize. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. They had already taken over the house, and now they were trying to take everything else. But I wasn't going to let them. Not without a fight. After that conversation with my father, I knew I couldn't sit back and let Hannah take everything from me. The house, the estate, everything my mother had worked so hard to build was slipping through my fingers, and I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. But the hardest part was realizing that my father wasn't on my side. He had chosen Hannah, chosen this new life over the family we had once been, and that left me feeling more alone than ever. But I wasn't going to let them take everything without a fight. The next few days were filled with tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Every time I saw Hannah, she was rearranging something, painting over my mother's carefully chosen colors, or throwing out old keepsakes she deemed clutter. Each change she made felt like a direct attack, a deliberate effort to erase my mother's presence from the home we had shared for so long. I couldn't take it anymore. One afternoon, I came home from work to find Hannah in the living room packing up my mother's antique china. She was boxing it up like it was just old junk, something that could be tossed aside and forgotten. I stood in the doorway, watching in disbelief as she carelessly handled the delicate pieces, the ones my mother had cherished, the ones that had been in our family for generations. What the hell are you doing? I demanded, my voice trembling with anger. Hannah looked up, startled for a moment, But then she straightened, flashing that infuriating smile. "Oh, Sarah, I didn't think you'd mind. Your father and I are making space for some new things, and this old stuff doesn't really fit with the new look we're going for." The new look? She was talking about my mother's belongings like they were outdated furniture in a thrift shop. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I walked over to the boxes, my hands shaking with fury. "You don't get to touch this," I said, my voice low but deadly serious. "This china was my mother's. It's been in our family for years. You have no right to pack it up like it's garbage." Hannah's smile faded, replaced by a condescending tone that made my blood boil. "Sarah, I understand that you're attached to these things, but it's time to let go. Your father and I are starting a new chapter, and we need space for our own things. You can't hold on to the past forever." My hands clenched into fists at my sides. "This isn't just the past, Hannah. This is my mother's legacy. You're not part of this family. You don't get to decide what stays and what goes." Her eyes flashed with irritation. "Actually, I am part of this family now. Your father and I are married, and this house belongs to us now. I know it's hard for you to accept, but it's time to move on." I could barely control my anger. "You don't get to erase my mother. You don't get to take over everything like you own it. I won't let you." Hannah stepped closer, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "And what are you going to do about it, Sarah? You can't stop this. Your father and I are married. Legally, everything he owns is ours. That includes this house, the estate, all of it. You might want to start accepting that." Her words hit me like a slap to the face. Legally, she was right. My father's marriage to her meant she had a claim to everything. The house, the estate, it was all under my father's name, and as his wife, she had as much right to it as I did. But I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I couldn't. "You may have legal rights, but this house isn't just property," I said through gritted teeth. "It's my family's history, my mother's history. You don't get to take that away from me." Hannah just smiled again, that same cold, calculating smile that made me want to scream. "We'll see about that." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of how to stop her. I knew I couldn't rely on my father. He was too blinded by his new life with Hannah to see what was really happening. But I couldn't sit back and let them take everything. The next morning, I decided to take action. I made an appointment with a lawyer, Claire, 45F, who specialized in estate law. I explained everything to her, the house, the estate, the marriage to Hannah, and how they were trying to take over everything. Claire listened carefully, nodding as I spoke. "It's a difficult situation," she said when I finished. "Legally, your father does have the right to manage his own property, and as his wife, Hannah has certain rights as well. But there may be a way to challenge this, especially if your mother's estate was involved in the property or if there were specific terms laid out in her will." I felt a flicker of hope. My mother did have a will. She left the estate to my father, but I don't think she ever imagined something like this happening. Claire leaned forward. "If we can find any indication that your mother's wishes were being ignored or that there was an intention for you to inherit part of the estate, we may have grounds to contest what's happening. It's not going to be easy, but you do have options." I nodded, feeling a small surge of determination. I wasn't powerless. There were things I could do to fight back, to protect what was mine, what had been my mother's. Claire gave me a list of documents to gather, including my mother's will, property records, and anything else that might show the estate's original intent. For the next few days, I buried myself in paperwork, combing through every document I could find. I went through my mother's old files, searching for anything that could help me build a case. And while I did, I stayed out of Hannah's way as much as possible, avoiding the tension that had turned the house into a battleground. But avoiding her didn't mean I was safe from her plans. One evening, I overheard her on the phone with a real estate agent, talking about future renovations and expanding the property. She was already planning on making massive changes, tearing apart the house that had been the heart of our family for generations. The more I listened, the more I realized how far she was willing to go. This wasn't just about redecorating or making the house her own. This was about claiming everything, turning my childhood home into something unrecognizable, something that had no connection to my mother, to me, or to the family we had been. It was clear now. This wasn't just a matter of legal rights. Hannah wanted to erase me from the picture, to take over completely and leave me with nothing. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I met with Claire again a few days later, bringing her everything I had found. She reviewed the documents carefully, nodding as she flipped through the pages. "This is good," she said finally. "It's not a guarantee, but we can make a case. If we can show that your mother intended for the estate to benefit you as well, or if we can demonstrate that your father's actions go against her wishes, we may be able to challenge their control over the property." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't over yet. I had a chance to fight back, to protect what my mother had left behind. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. My father and Hannah were determined to take over, and I had no doubt they would fight just as hard to keep everything in their hands. As I left Claire's office, I felt a sense of purpose growing inside me. I wasn't just fighting for the house or the estate. I was fighting for my mother's legacy, for the life she had built for me, for the future she had wanted for me. Hannah had underestimated me. She thought she could come in, take over, and erase me from my own family's history. But she was wrong. The fight was just beginning. As the weeks went by, the tension in the house reached a breaking point. Hannah and my father had fully settled in, and it felt like every day brought new changes. The living room was unrecognizable. My mother's carefully chosen furniture had been replaced with modern, sterile pieces that looked like they belonged in a showroom, not a home. The kitchen had been gutted and remodeled without a word to me. Even the family photos had disappeared, replaced by pictures of my father and Hannah on their honeymoon, smiling like they didn't have a care in the world. It felt like I was being erased, little by little, with every change they made. But while Hannah was busy playing house, I had been quietly building my case. Claire and I were making progress, slow but steady. We found several documents that pointed to my mother's wishes, including a letter she had written to her attorney not long before she passed away. In it, she had expressed her desire for the house to remain a part of our family, something that I could inherit one day. That letter was our strongest piece of evidence, and it gave me hope. Still, I knew we were running out of time. Hannah was moving quickly, and I had no doubt that she and my father were already planning their next move. The renovations, the changes, they weren't just about making the house their own. They were about solidifying their control, making it harder for me to claim anything when the time came. And then came the final blow. One evening, as I was coming home from a late meeting with Claire, I saw a for sale sign on the lawn. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I stood there in shock, staring at the sign like it couldn't possibly be real. But it was. They were selling the house. I stormed inside, my heart racing, and found my father sitting in the kitchen, casually flipping through the mail like nothing was wrong. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, holding up the for sale sign that I had ripped out of the ground. "You're selling the house." My father looked up, surprised by my outburst, but annoyingly calm. "Sarah, I thought we talked about this. The house is too big for just the two of us, and we decided to downsize. It's time to move on." Move on. The words rang in my ears. They weren't just moving on. They were selling my childhood home, the last real connection I had to my mother. And they hadn't even bothered to tell me. I had found out by seeing a sign in the yard, like some stranger passing by. "You didn't talk to me about this," I snapped, my voice trembling with anger. "You didn't ask me. You didn't even tell me. You're just going to sell it, like none of this matters. Like I don't matter." My father sighed, rubbing his temples like I was being unreasonable. "Sarah, you're overreacting. It's just a house." "No, it's not just a house," I said, my voice rising. "It's our home. It's where Mom raised me. It's where we were a family. You can't just sell it without even talking to me first." He stood up, his expression hardening. "I don't need your permission, Sarah. This is my decision, and it's already done. The house is going on the market next week." I felt like the ground was crumbling beneath me. "This isn't right, Dad. You can't just erase everything we had. You can't just erase Mom." He stared at me for a moment, his face unreadable. "I'm not erasing anything. I'm moving forward, and you need to do the same." Before I could respond, Hannah appeared in the doorway, looking perfectly composed. "Is everything okay in here?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake concern. I turned to her, my hands shaking with rage. "Did you know about this? Did you know they were selling the house?" Hannah gave a small shrug, that smug smile playing on her lips again. "Of course I knew. Your father and I made the decision together. It's time for a fresh start. A fresh start. That's all this was to her. A chance to wipe the slate clean, to take over my life and erase every trace of the family we had once been. I couldn't believe my father was going along with this. He was letting her take over everything. My mother's legacy, my childhood, and now my future. I couldn't hold back anymore. "This isn't a fresh start," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "This is you taking everything from me. You think you can just walk in here and take over, but you can't. This house isn't yours to sell. This estate isn't yours to control. It's not going to happen, Hannah." Hannah's smile faded, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer. "I think you'll find that it is happening, Sarah. Your father and I are legally married, and everything that belongs to him now belongs to me too. You're not the only one with a say in this." My father stood there, silent, watching the two of us like he wasn't sure how to handle the confrontation. I looked at him, hoping for some kind of support, some sign that he was on my side. But he just crossed his arms, his face expressionless. Hannah turned to him, placing a hand on his arm, her voice soft and manipulative. "Alan, honey, we've already made our decision. You know this is what's best for us. Sarah just needs time to come to terms with it." I couldn't take it anymore. Come to terms with it? You're trying to erase my entire family, and you expect me to just accept it. You're not going to take everything from me, Hannah. I won't let you. Hannah raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "And what exactly are you going to do, Sarah? You have no legal claim to the house. Your father and I are the ones making the decisions now. Maybe it's time for you to find your own place." It felt like a punch to the gut. She was telling me to leave, to pack up and go, like I didn't belong here anymore. Like I wasn't part of this family. I could feel the tears stinging my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of her. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. I turned to my father, my voice trembling. "Are you really okay with this? Are you really okay with selling the house? With letting her take over everything?" My father's face softened, but there was no hesitation in his voice. "It's what's best for us, Sarah. You need to let go." The words shattered me. Let go. Let go of my childhood, my family, my mother's memory. He was asking me to let go everything that had ever mattered to me. And for what? So he could start a new life with a woman half his age. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I wasn't going to let them break me. I had to fight back, no matter how hopeless it felt. "You can try to take everything," I said quietly, turning to face them both. "But I'm not going to make it easy for you. This house isn't yours, and I'm going to prove it. You won't win." Hannah's smile returned, cold and calculating. "We'll see about that." I left the room without another word, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Hannah had the law on her side, and my father's support. But I had something stronger, my mother's memory, and the determination to protect what was rightfully mine. The battle for the house, for the estate, for everything, had truly begun. And I wasn't going to back down. The days following my confrontation with Hannah and my father were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. I felt like I was fighting a war on two fronts, against Hannah, who was determined to take over everything, and against my father, who had become a stranger to me. The man who had once been my rock now stood by her side, watching as she dismantled my life piece by piece. But I wasn't about to give up. I couldn't. With Claire's help, I was making progress in building my case. The letter from my mother had given us a solid starting point. It wasn't ironclad, but it was enough to challenge their claim to the estate. If we could show that my mother intended for me to inherit a portion of the estate, or at least have a say in what happened to the house, we might be able to stop the sale. In the meantime, the house became a battlefield. Every day was a new reminder of how far Hannah was willing to go. She made a point of making me feel like an outsider in my own home, constantly redecorating, planning renovations, and throwing out things she deemed useless without even asking. Once, I caught her trying to toss out a box of my mother's old photo albums. The sight of her standing there, casually flipping through years of family memories, was too much. I snatched the box from her hands, my voice shaking with anger. "You don't get to throw these away." Hannah looked at me, her expression calm and patronizing. "Sarah, we're just clearing out some space. These old things don't have to be out in the open anymore. We need room for new memories." I held the box close to my chest, glaring at her. You don't get to decide what stays and what goes. These are my mother's memories. You have no right to touch them." She didn't argue, but I could see the annoyance in her eyes. "Fine. Keep them. But you're going to have to accept that this house isn't just yours anymore. It's ours now." Her words echoed in my mind, fueling the anger that was slowly growing into something more powerful. Resolve. Hannah had been treating this house like a project, like something she could mold into her perfect vision. But she didn't understand what it truly meant, what it stood for. And as much as I wanted to scream, to rage at the unfairness of it all, I knew that my best weapon was the legal case Claire and our building. I just had to hold on a little longer. The tipping point came one evening when I overheard a conversation between my father and Hannah. I had just come home from meeting with Claire, and as I walked through the hallway, I heard their voices drifting from the living room. "I've spoken to the realtor," Hannah was saying, her voice low but excited. "The offers are coming in, and we should be able to close the sale within the month." My heart dropped. The sale. It was happening sooner than I thought. "Are you sure this is the right thing?" my father asked, his voice hesitant for the first time in weeks. "I don't want to hurt Sarah. This house means a lot to her." Hannah's response was quick, smooth. "Alan, you're doing what's best for both of us. Sarah will be fine. She's an adult, and she needs to move on. This is our future now. She'll understand eventually." I stood frozen in the hallway, my blood boiling as I listened to them talk about my life like it was some minor obstacle they could brush aside. My father's hesitation was brief. Hannah's words had clearly reassured him. It was like he couldn't see what she was doing, how she was manipulating him, turning him against me. I had heard enough. I marched into the living room, my heart pounding. "You're really going through with this? You're selling the house?" Both of them looked up, startled by my sudden entrance. My father's expression was a mix of guilt and resignation, while Hannah just stared at me with that infuriating calmness, like she had already won. "Sarah, it's not what you think," my father began, but I cut him off. "It's exactly what I think. You're selling the house, my home, the place where Mom raised me. And you didn't even have the decency to tell me. I had to find out from a damn for sale sign in the yard." My father sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want it to be like this. I thought we could talk about it once everything was settled." "Settled?" I repeated, incredulous. "This isn't something you just settle. You're selling away everything that matters to me, everything that's left of our family, and you think I'm just going to stand by and let it happen?" Hannah stepped forward, her voice cool and controlled. "Sarah, we've already made our decision. This house is too big for the two of us, and we need to move on with our lives. You're going to have to accept that." I turned to her, my anger boiling over. "I don't have to accept anything. You've been trying to push me out since the day you moved in, and I'm not going anywhere. This house isn't yours to sell. It never was." Hannah's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You need to grow up, Sarah. This is happening whether you like it or not." I looked at my father, hoping, praying, that he would step in, that he would see what she was doing. But he just stood there, his eyes full of regret but no action. He wasn't going to stop her. He had chosen her over me. That was when I realized I couldn't rely on him anymore. He wasn't the man I had once known, the man who had been my father. He was gone, replaced by someone who couldn't see beyond Hannah's manipulation. But I wasn't going to give up. Not yet. The next day, Claire filed an injunction to stop the sale. The letter from my mother, combined with evidence that she had intended for the estate to be passed down to me, was enough to put the sale on hold. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it bought us time. Time to fight. When I told my father about the injunction, he was furious. "Sarah, what are you doing? Why are you making this so difficult?" I stared at him, the anger and pain clear in my voice. "I'm fighting for what's mine, Dad. I'm fighting for Mom." The look on his face, confusion, hurt, anger, told me everything I needed to know. He didn't understand. He couldn't see that this wasn't just about property or money. It was about family. It was about honoring my mother's memory, about protecting what she had built for us. But my father had already moved on, and I realized then that he wasn't going to come back. The legal battle dragged on for weeks. Claire was brilliant, and she fought tooth and nail to protect the estate. We were able to delay the sale, and eventually we reached a settlement. My father and Hannah wouldn't sell the house. Not immediately, at least, but I was granted control over a portion of the estate. It wasn't exactly what I had hoped for, but it was a victory in its own way. The house was saved for now. But something had shifted permanently between me and my father. He moved out not long after the settlement, taking Hannah with him. They bought a smaller home on the other side of town, and we barely spoke after that. He tried to reach out a few times, but the damage had been done. I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. He had chosen her, and in doing so, he had lost me. The house, the one place that still felt like home, was mine again. It was a bittersweet victory. I had fought for it, but it had cost me my relationship with my father. I spent days walking through the quiet rooms, trying to figure out what came next. I knew I couldn't stay in the past forever. My mother had built this home for me, for our family, and I had fought to protect her legacy. But now, it was time to build my own future. Hannah had tried to erase me. She had tried to take everything from me. But in the end, I had won.